Hi, my name is James Torito, and I'm the Global Campaigns Director for the Methane team at the Clean Air Task Force. I've been working on reducing methane emissions in the oil and gas sector with CATF for almost 4 years now. During this time, I've observed and documented methane emissions at upstream, midstream, and downstream facilities in almost 20 different countries around the world. Today, I'm going to talk to you about key emissions sources across these different market segments and what are some options to reduce emissions from those sources. Before I begin, I want to tell you about the fantastic handbook developed by the Commercial Law Development Program at the Department of Commerce. This provides the basis of this presentation, and you could look at Chapter 4 in the handbook to see more details about the presentation. I want to give a big thank you to the Department of State Bureau of Energy Resources for financing the work behind the handbook and the development of the handbook. The handbook seeks to add transferable, straightforward guidance on options for developing legal instruments. The laws, rules, and contract clauses that officials can put in place now to practically reduce methane. There's already broad consensus among the more responsible industry players and the climate and energy policymakers on how countries can reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. The technologies and practices, such as zero-emitting pneumatic pumps and control devices, leak detection and repair, flaring restrictions, exist and are well known. This handbook sets the stage for preparing a regulatory framework and the kind of technical assistance you will find from international experts. It is an invaluable tool and one you should understand and keep closely as you go through a regulatory development process. The handbook was co-written by a range of experts, including top government institutions and organizations who are working on methane regulatory policy internationally in the oil and gas sector. This includes my own organization, the Clean Air Task Force. Now, I want to begin this conversation by talking about variations across different countries. We know from more than a decade of research studies that methane leaks across the entire oil and gas supply chain, from the upstream segment to the downstream segment. Methane is a gas. Its natural state is to move and expand. So we can find leaks pretty much everywhere we have oil and gas infrastructure. But a country's priorities on reducing emissions and leaks are going to be determined by its market and its industry. For example, let's take the United States. The US is a market dominated by a large production system. It also has significant residential and industrial consumption. Therefore, the US must make policy across all segments of the supply chain, and it really needs to focus on all segments of the supply chain. Other countries and jurisdictions are slightly different. Take Japan and the European Union, for instance. Both jurisdictions are primarily import markets, relying on trade partners to supply greater than 90% of their oil and gas. Therefore, the primary segments of concern for them are going to be in the midstream and downstream segments. So when they're thinking about regulatory policy, that's where a lot of their focus might be. Similarly, as the example shows here about Bangladesh, Bangladesh is primarily an import market. Therefore, it has focused a lot of its policy efforts on the midstream and downstream segments. And you can see a case study here if you want to stop and read through some of the case study, which is highlighted further in the handbook, on how Bangladesh retrofitted its gas distribution systems within cities. Moving into the upstream segment, there are clear divisions between the three different market segments. The upstream segment is primarily when we're talking about oil and gas production. So we have equipment and assets that are associated with oil and gas production, oil and gas processing. In general, this includes oil and gas wells, liquids separation facilities where we're separating the oil and the gas, as well as the various different oils and liquids, as well as various different gases. And then gathering pipelines that carry oil and gas from production sites to processing sites. Most countries' production systems will follow this model more or less, but there might be slight variations or simplifications depending on different factors within the oil and gas system in that country. This could include the age of the production system, the reservoir composition, level of associated gas utilization, as well as the gas to oil ratio and other factors. This is really just a model example to understand that oil and gas comes from the pump jack or the oil well or the offshore platform, moves through the separation process, and then goes out through goes out through gathering lines to gas processing facilities. And as we dig into the different sources, you'll find most of the sources in the upstream in each of these types of facilities. So when it comes to different sources in the upstream segment, we have about 4 primary sources we need to be concerned about. And these are primarily, this is in regards to intentional venting or emissions. We'll deal with leaks and fugitive emissions in the other chapter based on leak detection, focused on leak detection and repair. So in the upstream sector, there's 4 primary pieces of equipment. First, and one of the largest ones that we see emissions from globally is hydrocarbon storage tanks. They are a huge source of emissions. Emissions can come from they often come from the intentional venting in order to release pressure from the tank. So there's ways that these emissions can be reduced. In order to do that, we would be routing the gas through control devices. So we might be sending the gas that's coming out of the tank directly to a flare, or we'll have a vapor recovery unit that is attached to the tank as well, that can then separate the methane and other associated gases, and then process it and sell it, or use it on site for electricity. Or a third possibility is to actually re-inject the gas back into the reservoir. So those will be some of the primary methods of reducing emissions from tanks. The second source of emissions that we often see in the upstream segment are wet seals on centrifugal compressors. So these are often a very common source when they're used, when they're still in use. So methane can be abated from wet seals either through a vapor recovery unit as well that's attached to the compressor unit, or by upgrading the seals to lower emitting dry seal technology. Sometimes technological upgrades might require additional costs, but if that gas is being sold to market or is being utilized for electricity, it will save money and have a quick return on investment in the end. The last 2 devices and instruments that I want to talk about in the upstream segment include pneumatic devices, which are controllers and pumps. These devices are used often for pressurizing natural gas, either to allow for pumping it and moving it along a pipeline, or to just generally control the pace and flow of the gases through the system. They're used in the absence of electricity, using the pressure that's already based within the system. There are many affordable devices on the market now that are zero emitting controllers and pumps. The return on investment, as I mentioned previously, similarly to both vapor recovery units as well as other control devices that we talked about in the last slide, the return on investment can be seen within just a few years. The final source of emission in the upstream segment that I want to highlight are manual liquid unloading. So this is temporarily diverting of the well to a lower pressure location to remove accumulated water. Often the ways to reduce emissions during manual liquid unloading are having on-site personnel at the site during the unloading operation and process. Now we're going to move to the midstream sector. So as we move into the midstream and downstream segments, we're mostly concerned with gas infrastructure. By the time oil moves into the midstream and downstream segments, most of the methane has actually been released from the gas, either through intentional separation, through oil and gas separators, or through non-intentional separation by putting it in storage tanks and recovering the methane from the storage tanks. So methane often separates fairly quickly from other liquid hydrocarbons. And so in midstream and downstream oil markets, we don't see too high of methane emissions. So in the midstream and downstream markets, we're primarily concerned with the gas infrastructure. The midstream sector that we're thinking about consists of transportation and transmission infrastructure. This includes LNG import and export terminals, as well as LNG tankers and ships, long distance pipelines and transmission compressor stations, which are used to, they're dotted about every 100 to 120 kilometers along a long distance transmission pipeline to continue a flow rate along the pipeline and continue to maintain pressure across the pipeline. And then there's storage facilities, often underground storage facilities or LNG storage facilities is also another way to store gas. So let's look at the common sources in the midstream sector now. We have some similar sources as in the upstream sector. So to start with, pneumatic devices might be deployed within the midstream segment by oil and gas companies in the absence of electricity on site. So the abatement options that we have for pneumatic devices are the same as in the upstream segments. We can replace pneumatic devices, high bleed pneumatic devices, with low bleed or zero emitting devices. It's important to inspect these devices as well on a regular basis. It's something that's going to be addressed in the leak detection and repair chapter of this handbook. And we can often just replace these devices with compressed air in order to help with the pneumatic controls. We also have hydrocarbon storage tanks. So again, abatement options are the same as I mentioned in the previous segments. We want to route any methane gas to a flare if we can, or to a vapor recovery system where it can be sold on the market, utilized locally for electricity production, or re-injected into a reservoir. Then we come to reciprocating compressors, which are much more common in the midstream segment. And what we have are called rod packing vents. Rod packing emissions typically do not occur around the rings, but through the gaskets around the packing case, between packing cups and between rings and the shaft. So the different options that we have for abatement, there's 4 options here. One is to attempt to reroute the gas, capturing it through a vapor recovery system and routing it to the compressor station, routing it through or compressor suction, and then routing it back into the gas system. Converting to a lower emitting dry sealed technology, which are being used now. We have the option of capturing the gas and sending it to a flare unit if in the midstream segment there are flares on site, which is not always the case, but ways to control that vented gas. And then it's important to continuously monitor and test the data to track the emissions and develop a predictive maintenance program. So when the vent seals start to wear out and tear down, they can be replaced quickly. So then we come back to wet seals, again, common if centrifugal compressors are being deployed on site. These, again, abatement options are similar in the upstream segment. We want to route any, to a control device like a flare if we can, if there's a flare on site, or reroute to a vapor recovery system where that gas then can be reinjected into the gas transmission system if that's available on site too, or it can be put into the site. The fourth emission source that we have in the midstream oil and gas sector, and this can often be a very large emissions in the midstream sector, which are pipeline blowdowns between compressor stations. So blowdowns are when gas is just released from a pipeline, and this can happen for a number of reasons, but typically because there's maintenance needed on the pipeline. What we want to do is reduce the amount of gas that's being released into the atmosphere, obviously. This can be done through capturing the vented gas. You can have mobile compressor units, maybe that are deployed to where the blowdown will be occurring, and so that you can capture that gas through a mobile compressor unit, or if you have recompression at the compressor station, to release the gas through the system at the compressor station itself. Compressor stations, transmission meters, regulation station, above ground facilities. These are locations where you often see fugitive and vented gas. So compressor stations are where a lot of the compressor units are going to be held. But I want to focus here on some of the smaller sites, which are the transmission meters, measuring stations, regulator stations at above ground facilities. These are, very small stations that are dotted across the pipelines. They could be found outside of compressor station facilities, or they could be near where a transmission pipeline is being converted into a distribution pipeline. And this is going to be addressed again in the leak detection and repair section, but you want to, in order to control emissions at these smaller sites, it's important to conduct periodic leak detection and repair programs. So this might include, also redesigning the venting or emergency blowdown systems to simulate or redirect gas back into the system during testing, measuring, metering, and then installing continuous monitoring to make sure that any emissions that are occurring there are happening at small levels and not above what's considered normal operating conditions. Then we move on to engines and other combustion devices, which are common at midstream sectors. Engines and other combustion devices might be used, like dehydrators. These different combustion devices will have different purposes. The engines might be used to help moving gas along and compressing the gas as well. Incomplete combustion often occurs through through the engines, and so there'll be what we call methane slip into the atmosphere. This usually happens at lower percentages. As engines get older, the methane slip will often increase. So as there's more use in the engines, it's important to periodically tune up the engines, check the engines, have a regular maintenance program, and process monitoring and control optimization systems that allow you to understand if the methane slip that's occurring from the engine system is around average normal operating conditions per manufacturer's instructions, or if it's gone above average, to make sure that some maintenance is going to occur, or the engine needs to be replaced and repaired with more advanced technology that has come along. And then the final source of emissions that we often see in the midstream sector are along pipelines. Transmission pipelines can leak due to integrity failures. So if there's sour gas or very acidic gas, it can create corrosion either along the main transmission pipeline, along many nuts and parts of the system, as well as valves and anything else. So unintentional damage does also occur from weather events. This can be depending on, which country or where your oil and gas system is located. This could be landslides. It could be floods. It could also occur from, third parties that are maybe digging in an area that doesn't know where a pipeline is. So these are important to monitor. Having leak detection and repair programs, also, or continuous monitoring systems. In some cases, you can use either looking and monitoring the pressure of the pipelines, using acoustics to test and make sure that you can sometimes hear whether there's some hissing along the pipelines as well. And so, periodic surveys across using potentially, different technologies would be important to monitor and track pipelines as well. Okay, so we're now moving into the last segment, the downstream segment. So in the downstream segment, we're talking about distribution networks. This is where the gas is going usually within cities to end consumers, often residential households, sometimes commercial and industrial users, such as major businesses and manufacturers. And so the next two slides are going to talk about common sources of methane emissions in the downstream segment. Primary abatement options and potential trade-offs. So similar to transmission segment, we have a lot of pipelines. We might even have more pipelines. We probably have more pipelines in the downstream segment than we are in the midstream or upstream segments. That's because the pipelines often in distribution networks are smaller. They're more diffuse and dispersed, so they're going to more locations. They have much more endpoints, and what that means is it results in a lot more different connections, valves that are prone to failure too. So in distribution pipelines, we have the ability for integrity failures, often from corrosion, and it really depends on how it could very well depend on the type of material that is being used for the pipelines itself. So are the pipelines made from cast iron? Are they made from more modern PVC piping or plastic materials? Some of the plastic materials are not necessarily state of the art, and then can fail. So it depends on the type of material that's used for these pipelines. And older pipelines use material that was more likely to corrode over time, and likely has. The U.S. is fairly notorious for having very old gas distribution systems within many of its cities, and therefore has a lot of problems with leakages within city grid distribution systems. It's important to have damage prevention programs, such as calling before you dig. So people digging, you often have a lot more people in city grids, either at their homes or elsewhere, maybe digging on the property and potentially hitting a gas line. that likelihood increases where you have much more line also in residential areas. So prevention programs are critical, not just before you dig, but also having public response programs. So and reporting mechanisms that you know the community knows when they smell a leak, they know who to call and raise that awareness. That will help reduce both pipeline ruptures from digging activities, but also the quick repair of any pipeline too. Having enhanced LDAR programs is critical as well. You know, there are many programs now where, you know, just driving around city, regular continuous monitoring, or driving through cities with technology that can detect emissions from different locations is critical as well. So another common leak point within city grid distributions are customer meters. So these are leaking components that are loose fitting because they're loose fitting, or they're venting from pressure regulators, or regulators failed. These might be at residential homes. I've personally smelled many leaks from residential homes outside the home from different points. And then there's also commercial industrial meters that might be, you know, having larger flow rates and include pneumatic devices with a higher potential to emit because of the flow rates, but also the potential that they are getting more use. So enhanced leak detection and repair programs, there you might use aerial surveys or mobile vehicle surveys with analyzers that can detect small traces of methane in the atmosphere to sense where data is, to bring back data sets of where high points of methane concentrations are within the city. There's also an option of installing advanced metering networks, which can use data analytics on the customer side of the meter to find leaks, whether this is through anomalies in hourly consumption rates. So if a consumption rate on the customer's meter has increased drastically higher than normal or average operating conditions, then that might be the result of a leak that is beyond the meter. And then one option is also to redesign the meters to reduce leak points. This could include changing, from displacement to sonic meters for residential, or eliminating leak points where possible. So there's some capital costs to that as well. I didn't go into a lot of the implementation challenges or known considerations as I've been talking about these emission sources, but they're well documented in the handbook, and I highly encourage you to review the handbook, as this was just a really quick, brief overview of some of the emission sources that we see in the upstream, midstream, and downstream segments of the oil and gas industry. So with that presentation, I hope this was helpful. Again, the handbook is going to be an excellent guide to assist you in your process and trying to think about how to understand these emission sources, how to abate them, and how to write policy and legislation that quickly tackles addressing some of these issues. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. Hopefully, might have some time, to meet in the future and talk to you about these issues. So thank you very much.